Imagine walking into a bank, asking where the missing $500 million went, and the manager answers by giving you a speech about office furniture, teamwork, and long-term discipline. That is basically what happened when Senator Chris Coons put Kash Patel under the lights. This was not a normal Senate hearing. This was not a polite budget conversation wrapped in marble walls and congressional manners. This was a stress test for whether the man sitting in front of the committee could answer a direct question when the number on the table was $500 million. The FBI had hundreds of positions sitting empty, and his own explanation suggested it could take up to 14 years to fully close the staffing gap. So here's the question. When Senator Chris Coons asked Kash Patel which version of the story was true, why did the answer suddenly become bigger, longer, smoother, and somehow less direct? Coons did not come in swinging like a cable news performer hunting for a clip. He came in like a prosecutor who already had the exhibit marked, dated, and waiting on the table. Within 24 hours, Kash Patel had presented one position to the Senate and another position to the House on the same core issue. Same budget pressure, same federal agency, same public responsibility, but not the same message. And that is where this hearing changed. Because once Coons identified that contradiction, Patel had a choice. He could explain it plainly. He could reconcile the record. He could say which statement reflected the real policy. Instead, Patel moved into the safest language in Washington. Waste, fraud, abuse, efficiency, cost-cutting, long-term management. It sounded polished. It sounded official. But it did not answer the question. And in a room like that, silence does not always mean nobody is speaking. Sometimes silence is what appears inside the answer when the truth refuses to sit down. Coons did not ask Kash Patel to deliver a motivational seminar on government efficiency. He asked him to explain a contradiction. That is the difference Patel kept trying to blur. A $500 million issue was sitting in the middle of the hearing like a suitcase nobody wanted to open, and Coons kept pointing at the handle. He laid out the problem with the kind of calm that makes evasion look even louder. One position had been presented to the Senate. Another had been presented to the House. Same agency, same budget universe, same public record, different message. So Coons pressed the only question that mattered. Which one should Congress believe? That question was not complicated. It did not require a philosophy of management. It did not require a tour through every broken pipe in federal bureaucracy. It required alignment. It required accountability. It required Kash Patel to tell the committee whether the FBI needed the money, did not need the money, or was trying to sell two different versions of fiscal reality depending on which room he was sitting in. And Patel's answer, while controlled, moved around the center of the question. He talked about waste. He talked about fraud. He talked about abuse. He talked about cutting unnecessary spending and finding efficiencies inside the Bureau. But notice what he did not do. He did not clearly resolve the two-position problem Coons had placed in front of him. That is where the prosecutorial frame begins. Because in Oversight, the answer is not judged by how many words it contains. It is judged by whether those words land on the question. And here, the words kept orbiting the question like a plane refusing to touch the runway. Coons understood that immediately, so he did not chase the speech. He returned to the contradiction. Then Coons moved the hearing from money to manpower, and that is where the numbers stopped sounding like accounting and started sounding like risk. Because a budget line can look cold on paper, a vacancy cannot. A vacancy means an investigation waits longer. A field office stretches thinner. A case agent carries more weight. A threat assessment gets processed inside a system already running short. And according to the exchange, the FBI was not dealing with a tiny staffing hiccup. It was dealing with hundreds of empty positions. So Coons put the obvious contradiction on the table. How does Kash Patel defend cutting resources while the Bureau is already below full strength? That is not a partisan trick question. That is basic math with national security attached to it. Patel acknowledged the vacancies. He did not deny that the positions existed, but then he shifted the frame again. Hiring takes time. Training takes time. Building the pipeline takes time. And then came the number that should have made the room freeze. Up to 14 years. 14 years. That is not a hiring delay. That is a child entering kindergarten and almost graduating high school before the gap fully closes. And somehow, this was supposed to make the staffing problem sound more manageable. But Coons saw the trap immediately. If it takes 14 years to fill the gap, then the shortage is not less urgent. It is more urgent, because the question was not whether hiring is complicated. Everybody knows it is complicated. The question was, what happens right now, while the vacancies are real, the threats are current, and the funding debate is still alive? Patel gave a process answer. Coons was asking for an operational answer, and those are not the same thing. Then Coons turned to the part of government that sounds boring, right up until it becomes the only thing standing between power and abuse. Oversight, internal integrity, independent review, the machinery that is supposed to make sure the FBI does not simply grade its own homework with a gold pen and a straight face. Coons brought up the Office of Integrity and Compliance, a unit that existed to provide accountability inside the Bureau. And now that office was no longer standing on its own. It had been folded into another division. Patel called it duplicative. That is one of those words Washington loves because it sounds clean, technical, harmless. Duplicative sounds like someone found two staplers on the same desk. But Coons was not asking about office supplies. He was asking about independence. Because when an oversight function gets absorbed into the same internal structure it is supposed to scrutinize, the question is not whether the flowchart looks simpler. The question is whether the watchdog still has teeth. Patel framed the move as efficiency, consolidation, streamlining, reducing overlap. But once again, the answer addressed the architecture, not the danger. Coons wanted to know what happens when the public is told to trust an accountability system that has just been pulled closer to the people it may need to investigate. That is not a small detail. That is the lock on the evidence room. That is the camera in the hallway. That is the witness who is supposed to speak without checking whether the boss is listening. And Patel never fully closed that concern. He defended the structure, but Coons was questioning the trust behind it. Then the hearing moved into the most politically sensitive territory in the room. Personnel decisions tied to January 6th investigations. And suddenly, this was no longer just about money, staffing charts, or bureaucratic reorganization. This was about whether people inside the FBI could do their assigned work on politically explosive cases and still trust that their careers would not become collateral damage. Coons asked the question plainly. Would agents who worked on January 6th cases be targeted because of that involvement? That question did not need a dissertation. It needed a commitment. It needed a clear line. It needed Kash Patel to say, directly, that case assignment would not become a political weapon inside the Bureau. But Patel did what he had done throughout the hearing. He moved to principle. He said, in effect, that assignments do not determine career outcomes. That sounds reasonable. It sounds procedural. It sounds like the kind of sentence that belongs in an HR manual under fluorescent lights. But Coons was not asking for an HR manual. He was asking whether real people, real agents, with real names and real careers, could be punished for having touched one of the most politically charged investigations in modern American life. And that is where the answer felt too careful. Because there is a difference between saying, we have general principles, and saying, no, they will not be targeted. One is a cushion, the other is a line. And in that room, under that pressure, Patel chose the cushion. That matters because institutions do not collapse only when someone openly announces corruption. Sometimes they weaken when leaders refuse to give the public the one sentence that would make retaliation impossible to hide later. And that is the real moral scene here. Not the polished table, not the microphones, not the calm tone, not the ritual of senators asking questions while cameras blink in the back of the room. The real scene is outside that hearing room, where an FBI office is still missing people, where investigations still need agents, where threats do not wait for a 14-year hiring pipeline to finish politely in the background. The real scene is the field office trying to do more with less while Washington dresses scarcity up as efficiency. The real scene is the public being asked to trust an institution whose oversight structure has been rearranged, whose staffing gap is unresolved, whose budget story changed depending on the room, and whose leader still would not always land the answer exactly where the question demanded. That is why this exchange between Chris Coons and Kash Patel matters. Not because it gives one party a clean talking point, not because it produces some cheap viral moment where everyone claps and the internet declares a knockout. It matters because democratic oversight only works when direct questions receive direct answers. When Congress asks about a $500 million contradiction, the answer cannot be a fog machine labeled efficiency. When Congress asks about hundreds of vacant FBI positions, the answer cannot hide behind a 14-year timeline, as if time itself is a management plan. When Congress asks whether agents will be protected from political targeting, the answer should not need translation. Because the deeper question is not whether Kash Patel sounded calm. He did. The deeper question is whether calmness became a substitute for clarity. And if the people with power can turn every hard question into a long explanation that never quite touches the center, then what does accountability even mean? So ask yourself this. When the record needed a straight answer, did Kash Patel give Congress full accountability? Or did he give it controlled distance dressed up as leadership? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like this video if you think hearings should demand real answers, not polished evasions. Share it so more people can see what was actually said and what was carefully left unsaid. And subscribe for more breakdowns where we follow the evidence, not the spin.